I'm Helen. I'm 82 years old. And the first time I realized something was changing, I was standing in my own kitchen. A contractor had come to discuss a few modifications to my house after a minor fall. My son Mark stood beside me. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. Then the contractor asked a question about widening a doorway. Before I could answer, Mark answered for me. The contractor nodded. He wrote something on his clipboard. A few minutes later, he asked about the bathroom. Again, Mark answered first. Again, the contractor nodded. I remember opening my mouth twice and never getting the chance to speak. The strange part wasn't that, Mark answered. The strange part was how natural it felt to everyone else. Nobody paused. Nobody looked uncomfortable. Nobody said, "Let's ask Helen." The conversation simply continued. Then the contractor pointed toward the hallway. If she plans to stay here long term, we'll probably want additional changes. He looked directly at Mark, not at me. Mark nodded. The contractor nodded back, and the discussion moved forward without me. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. People make assumptions. People get distracted. Besides, Mark was only trying to help. After all, he'd been helping more often since my fall. I couldn't blame him for that. The fall had frightened him more than it frightened me. I slipped on a wet board near the back porch. I bruised my hip, spent one night in the hospital. By the following week, I was back home. To me, the whole thing felt minor. To Mark and his wife, Lisa, it felt much bigger. Almost overnight, they became deeply interested in every detail of my daily life. At first, I appreciated it. I still do in many ways. Getting older means accepting help when you need it. The problem was that I wasn't always sure when help stopped being help, or when concern started becoming something else. A few days after the contractor visit, Mark came by with groceries. That wasn't unusual. He'd been doing that occasionally for years, but this visit felt different. He walked into the kitchen and immediately started organizing things. He checked expiration dates, moved items between shelves, made notes on a small pad, suggested a meal delivery service, suggested a medication organizer, suggested a cleaning service, suggested replacing the rug in my hallway. Every suggestion sounded reasonable. Every suggestion came from a good place. Yet somehow I noticed that none of them began with a question. They began with a solution. I watched him moving around the kitchen, busy, efficient, certain. For a brief moment, I felt like a guest in my own house. The feeling disappeared quickly, but it returned more often after that. A week later, Lisa called me about an upcoming medical appointment. "Don't forget Thursday," she said. "I won't." There was a pause. Then she added something unexpected. "Mark already completed most of the paperwork." I frowned. "What paperwork?" "The intake forms." I sat up straighter. "I haven't even seen them." Another pause. "Oh." Lisa sounded surprised. "I thought he showed them to you." Apparently, he hadn't. Nothing important had been changed, just routine information, emergency contacts, insurance details, medical history, the kind of forms families help with all the time. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it afterward. Not because I objected, because I hadn't known it was happening. That seemed to be occurring more frequently. Things weren't being hidden from me, but they also weren't being discussed with me beforehand. I was learning about them after they were already done. A few days later, I attended my granddaughter's soccer game. The weather was beautiful. Families lined the sidelines in folding chairs. After the game, everyone gathered near the parking lot. One of my cousins smiled and asked how I was recovering from my fall. Before I answered, Mark answered, "She's doing great." Everyone nodded. The conversation moved on. No one meant any harm. I know that. But standing there, I realized something. Nobody had even noticed I hadn't spoken. The answer came from Mark. The answer was accepted, and that was the end of it. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it stayed with me for days, because it wasn't really about my fall. It was about something else. Something harder to define. The feeling that people were becoming accustomed to hearing from Mark instead of me. As spring turned into summer, these moments became more common. Small moments, easy moments. Moments that sounded insignificant when described out loud. A neighbor asked Mark whether I still drove at night. A church friend asked Mark whether I needed help maintaining the yard. Someone asked Mark if I planned to travel during the holidays. Every question involved me. Every answer came from him. And every answer seemed perfectly acceptable to everyone listening. I kept waiting for someone to say, "Let's ask Helen," but nobody did. One afternoon, I received a call from a contractor's office. The receptionist sounded confused. "Is this Mark?" "No," she apologized immediately. Then she explained that she was following up regarding discussions about accessibility upgrades at my property. My property, not Mark's, mine. Yet somehow his number had become the primary contact. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat quietly for several minutes. There was probably a simple explanation. Mark handled details. People naturally called him. That was all. At least that's what I told myself. But the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. One event meant nothing. 2 events meant little. 10 events felt different. The following Saturday, Mark stopped by, carrying a thick folder. He spread several documents across my dining room table. Contractor estimates, modification plans, cost comparisons, measurements, recommendations. I looked through them slowly. Some pages were already marked with notes. Questions had been written in the margins. Several estimates were weeks old. I looked up. "When did you get all these?" "A while ago." "A while ago?" Mark shrugged. "I wanted to compare options first." He said it casually, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. But I couldn't stop staring at the dates. Entire conversations had happened before I knew they existed. Entire discussions. Entire evaluations. Entire plans. I wasn't being excluded intentionally. At least I didn't think so. Yet somehow I always seemed to arrive near the end of the process, never at the beginning. That realization unsettled me more than I expected. Not because I thought Mark was trying to control me. Because I trusted him. I still trusted him. The uncomfortable part was realizing how easily everyone had slipped into these new roles. Mark organized. Mark researched. Mark answered. Mark coordinated. And the rest of us followed along. One evening, I attended a church social event. Several people from the congregation were there. At one point, a woman I'd known for years approached me. Before she could speak, she noticed Mark standing nearby. "Oh, good," she said. "I was hoping to ask you something." She turned toward him. Not me. Him. Then she asked whether I'd be staying in my house much longer. Mark answered. The conversation continued. I stood there listening, smiling politely, feeling strangely invisible, not ignored, not forgotten, just slightly off-center, as though my life had become a discussion taking place one chair away from where I was sitting. That feeling followed me home. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing something else. Conversations about my future often stopped when I entered a room, not dramatically, not suspiciously, just enough for me to notice. A sentence left unfinished. A topic suddenly changed. A glance exchanged between family members. Nothing obvious, nothing alarming, but enough to leave questions behind. Questions I couldn't answer. Questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Then something happened that I couldn't easily dismiss. One afternoon, I stopped by Mark and Lisa's house. Lisa was preparing for a family event. I offered to help organize paperwork and supplies. While sorting through several folders on the dining room table, I came across a stack of documents. I wasn't snooping. The papers were sitting openly in plain sight. Across the top of the first page was a heading, Housing Options. I froze. Beneath it were pages of notes, detailed notes, not casual notes, not random information collected from the internet. This looked organized, intentional, professional. I slowly turned the first page, then another, and another. The documents compared different living arrangements, remaining at home, retirement communities, assisted living facilities, support programs, projected costs, waiting lists, advantages, disadvantages. Some sections had been highlighted, others contained handwritten comments. The stack was thick, far thicker than anything prepared on a whim. I stared at the pages for a long moment. No one had ever mentioned this research to me. No one had asked what I thought. No one had asked whether I wanted these options explored. And yet, someone had clearly spent a great deal of time thinking about where I might live in the future. I carefully returned every page exactly where I found it. Then I sat down at the table. For the first time, a question entered my mind that I could no longer ignore. What if all those small moments were connected? And if they were connected, how many conversations about my future had already happened without me? I drove home that afternoon with more questions than answers. The papers themselves weren't the problem. Anyone could research housing options. Anyone could compare services. Anyone could gather information. The uncomfortable part was realizing how much work had already been done before I knew any of it existed. For several days, I said nothing. I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Mark was organized. Lisa liked planning ahead. That was simply who they were. Still, I found myself paying closer attention. Not because I wanted to investigate my family, because I wanted to understand what was happening. The following week, I attended a routine checkup. Mark offered to drive me. I almost said no. Then I agreed. The appointment itself went smoothly. My doctor asked a few questions. I answered them. Everything felt normal, until the end. The doctor mentioned a few recommendations for the future. Nothing urgent, nothing serious, just suggestions. Additional support if needed. Home safety improvements. Things people my age often discuss. As the appointment ended, the doctor handed several brochures across the desk. Not to me, to Mark. The movement was small, probably unconscious, but I noticed it immediately. Mark noticed it too. He accepted the brochures without hesitation. The doctor continued speaking. Most of his comments were directed toward Mark. I sat quietly, listening, watching, trying to understand why something about the exchange bothered me so much. When we left the office, neither of us mentioned it. Yet, I kept thinking about it during the drive home. Not because the doctor had been rude. He hadn't. Not because Mark had done anything wrong. He hadn't. The moment bothered me because it felt familiar. Very familiar. Another conversation. Another situation. Another moment where someone naturally looked to Mark first. A few days later, I received a phone call from my cousin Nancy. We talked for a while about family news. Then she casually mentioned something. I heard Mark has been looking into options. I gripped the phone a little tighter. What options? There was a pause. Nancy sounded surprised. I thought you knew. Knew what? Oh, another pause. I probably shouldn't have said anything. That answer told me more than anything else could have. The conversation moved on. But I barely heard the rest of it. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table staring out the window. Somehow my cousin believed there were discussions taking place, discussions I wasn't part of. And she seemed surprised that I didn't know. That realization stayed with me. The next Sunday, I attended church as usual. After the service, several people gathered in the fellowship hall. I was speaking with a longtime friend when another member approached. She smiled warmly. Then she asked a question. "How's Mark handling everything?" I blinked. "Handling what?" "With the house." The woman looked confused, then embarrassed. "Oh, never mind." She quickly changed the subject. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds, yet it left me unsettled. How many people knew something I didn't? Or perhaps they didn't know anything. Perhaps they simply assumed Mark was handling things. That possibility bothered me almost as much. Over the next month, I noticed another change. Family conversations increasingly included phrases like, "We'll figure it out." "We've been discussing options." "We just want to be prepared." None of those statements sounded threatening. In fact, they sounded responsible, thoughtful, loving. That was the difficult part. Nobody was trying to hurt me. Nobody was pressuring me. Nobody was demanding anything. The shift was happening quietly. So quietly that I sometimes wondered whether I was imagining it. Then something happened that made it much harder to dismiss. One evening, I stopped by Mark's house for dinner. My grandchildren were setting the table. Lisa was finishing a casserole in the kitchen. Everything felt normal, comfortable, familiar. Halfway through dinner, one of the children asked a simple question. "Grandma, are you still going to be in your house next Christmas?" The room became very quiet. Not dramatically quiet, just enough for everyone to notice. I looked up. Before I could answer, Mark spoke. "We don't know yet." The conversation moved on. Nobody seemed alarmed. Nobody reacted. But the words stayed with me. We don't know yet. Who was we? And why did the answer belong to him? That night, I couldn't sleep. I wasn't angry. I wasn't frightened. I was confused. The feeling reminded me of standing in a room where everyone understood the conversation except me. A few days later, I found myself replaying dozens of small moments. The contractor, the paperwork, the phone calls, the questions directed to Mark, the research documents, the comments from relatives. None of them seemed important alone. Together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. For the first time, I started wondering whether my family saw my future differently than I did. Not because they wanted to control me, because they wanted certainty, a plan, preparation, organization, the things responsible families value. Yet somewhere inside all that preparation, I seemed to be losing something. I just wasn't sure what. Late one afternoon, Lisa called. We chatted briefly. Then she mentioned an upcoming family barbecue. "Everyone should be there," she said. "A lot of people?" "Most of them." I told her I'd come. After we hung up, I wrote the date on my calendar. At the time, it felt like an ordinary family gathering. Nothing more. I had no reason to think otherwise. But over the following week, I found myself remembering several recent conversations, questions, comments, assumptions, pieces that didn't quite fit together. The feeling grew stronger. Not fear, not yet. Just a growing awareness that something was happening around me. Something larger than a few awkward conversations. Something larger than a contractor speaking to the wrong person. For months, I had been dismissing each moment individually. Now I was beginning to see them collectively, and the picture they created was becoming harder to ignore. By the time the family barbecue arrived, I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I wasn't trying to catch anyone doing anything wrong. I simply wanted to understand whether all these small moments were connected. Because if they were connected, then the issue wasn't a contractor, or paperwork, or housing brochures. The issue was something much bigger, something that involved my future. And for the first time, I was beginning to wonder whether everyone else had already started preparing for that future before I had. The family barbecue took place 2 weeks after I found the housing documents. I almost didn't go. Not because I was upset, because I wasn't sure I wanted to hear any more surprises. Still, family gatherings mattered to me. They always had. So I showed up carrying a bowl of potato salad and a smile that felt mostly genuine. Mark and Lisa were already busy when I arrived. Tables had been arranged across the backyard. Children ran through the grass. Several relatives sat beneath a large shade tree. Everything looked exactly the way it always had, at least at first. I spent the first hour talking with cousins I hadn't seen in months. The conversations felt normal, comfortable. For a little while, I managed to forget about the papers, the research, the unanswered questions. Then I noticed something. A group of relatives had gathered around Mark near the grill. I wasn't paying attention at first, until I heard my name. That immediately caught my attention. I wasn't trying to listen, but I couldn't help hearing the conversation. One of my cousins looked at Mark and asked, "So, have you decided yet?" Mark looked confused. Decided what? The housing situation. The conversation stopped for a moment. Then another relative joined in. "I thought you were comparing a few places." Someone else nodded. "I heard there was one near the lake." Nobody looked at me. Nobody asked me anything. The entire discussion was directed toward Mark, as though he were the person making the decision, as though I were simply the subject being discussed. I stood only a few feet away, close enough to hear every word, far enough away to feel invisible. That was the first moment I realized the situation had grown larger than my immediate family. Before then, I had assumed the conversations were happening between Mark and Lisa. Now it was obvious that others had heard about them too. The idea had spread. People already believed plans were being made, and somehow they expected Mark to know the answers. The conversation ended quickly. Mark changed the subject. People moved on. Nobody seemed uncomfortable. Nobody appeared to think anything unusual had happened. I spent the rest of the afternoon smiling and participating like everyone else, but inside, something had shifted. Not authority, not yet. Awareness. I drove home that evening thinking about assumptions. How they start, how they grow, how eventually they become accepted facts. Nobody had asked whether I wanted to move. Yet people were already discussing where I might go. That realization stayed with me all week. A few days later, I called a contractor who had previously visited my house. I wanted information about a small repair in the laundry room. The woman who answered the phone was friendly. After confirming my address, she paused. "Oh, what is it?" "We already spoke with Mark about this property." I felt my stomach tighten slightly. "What did you discuss?" "Future accessibility recommendations." She sounded completely relaxed, as though the answer were obvious, as though Mark naturally handled those conversations. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat staring at the phone. The problem wasn't that Mark had spoken with them. The problem was that everyone else seemed to assume he should. That distinction felt increasingly important. Over the next month, similar moments continued appearing. A neighbor stopped while walking her dog. She asked whether I had chosen a timeline yet. A timeline for what? For the house? I smiled politely. She immediately looked embarrassed. I thought Mark was working through the options. Options, another word that kept appearing. People talked about options, plans, possibilities, alternatives, future arrangements, yet nobody discussed those things directly with me. Everything seemed to pass through Mark first. One Saturday morning, I received a packet in the mail. Inside were brochures, home modification services, accessibility upgrades, senior housing resources. The mailing label was addressed to me, but attached to the front was a note, for Helen and Mark. Not Helen. Helen and Mark. The difference was subtle, yet it bothered me more than I expected, because it suggested partnership, shared decision-making, joint planning. Except nobody had ever asked whether I wanted a partner in these decisions. As summer moved toward fall, conversations became increasingly practical. Mark started discussing costs, not moving costs, planning costs, consultation costs, evaluation costs. He spoke as though gathering information was simply the responsible thing to do, and perhaps it was. Still, I noticed something. The information gathering never seemed to require my approval. It simply happened. One evening, Mark stopped by carrying a folder. Another folder. I had begun to dislike folders. Folders usually meant decisions were approaching. He spread several pages across the dining room table. Most involved possible modifications to my house. Bathroom updates. Wider hallways. Entryway changes. The pages were organized neatly. Measurements, timelines, cost estimates, recommendations. I looked through them carefully. Then I asked, "When did all this start?" Mark shrugged. "A while ago." The answer sounded familiar, too familiar. I had heard it before. A while ago. At some point, I realized many important conversations seemed to begin a while ago, long before I learned they existed. That thought lingered after Mark left. Not because I believed anyone was trying to hide things, because I increasingly felt like I was joining conversations halfway through. The beginning had already happened elsewhere. A few weeks later, another uncomfortable moment arrived. I attended a church luncheon. Several longtime friends were there. People I had known for decades. Halfway through the meal, someone asked whether I planned to stay in my home through winter. Before I could answer, another person replied, "I think Mark's still evaluating everything." Everyone nodded. The conversation continued. Nobody corrected the statement. Nobody looked toward me. I remember sitting there quietly, listening to strangers discuss my future as though it belonged to a committee. That feeling stayed with me long after lunch ended. Not anger, not resentment, something heavier, something harder to define. A growing awareness that decisions about my future no longer seemed to begin with me. They began somewhere else, then eventually arrived in my presence. By early October, I noticed another shift. Relatives increasingly asked Mark for updates, not opinions, updates. As though a process were already underway. As though everyone assumed progress was being made. The questions sounded harmless. How are things going? Any changes? Still exploring options? The language itself told a story. There was already a process, already movement, already planning, and Mark appeared to be managing it. One afternoon, I stopped by Lisa's house, unexpectedly. She wasn't home. Mark wasn't home either. A stack of papers sat on the kitchen counter. I wasn't searching for anything. The documents were impossible to miss. Across the top of one page were the words, "Housing Consultation Preparation." I froze. The packet included discussion topics, questions, future planning considerations, evaluation categories, Someone had clearly been preparing for a formal meeting, not researching anymore. Preparing. That distinction mattered. Research explores possibilities. Preparation expects action. For the first time, I felt a genuine sense of concern. Not fear, concern. The situation seemed to be moving forward, whether I was moving with it or not. I carefully placed everything back where I found it. Then I drove home. The entire way, I thought about one question. If there was going to be a consultation, why hadn't anyone discussed it with me? That question remained unanswered for several days. Then Mark called. "Helen, are you free next Thursday afternoon?" "Why?" "We'd like you to come to a meeting." I already knew what meeting he meant, but I asked anyway. "What kind of meeting?" There was a brief pause. Then he answered, "A housing consultation." The words landed differently now, because they were no longer theoretical, no longer research, no longer possibilities. A meeting had been scheduled. A date had been chosen. Plans were moving forward. And somehow I felt as though I had been invited into the process rather than included from the beginning. I agreed to attend. What else could I do? After hanging up, I sat quietly in my kitchen. The same kitchen where this entire story seemed to begin. The contractor, the questions, the assumptions, the folders, the conversations, the plans. One by one, they connected. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether the meeting would answer my questions or confirm my fears. Either way, something important was waiting on the other side of that room. And I had a feeling my life would look different once I walked into it. For the next several days, the meeting stayed in the back of my mind. Not constantly, but often enough. I would be washing dishes and suddenly think about it. I'd be reading a book and remember it again. The housing consultation. The words felt official, more official than anything that had happened before. Contractors were one thing. Research was another. Family conversations were something else entirely. A consultation felt different. A consultation suggested direction, movement, a next step. What troubled me wasn't the meeting itself. It was the feeling that everyone else already understood its purpose. Everyone except me. A few days before the appointment, Lisa stopped by with coffee. We sat together at my kitchen table. The conversation began normally. Family news, grandchildren, church events. Then she mentioned the meeting. "I think it'll be helpful." I nodded. "Helpful for what?" She hesitated, then smiled. "Just understanding your options." Your options. The phrase sounded familiar. I'd heard it many times by then. Options, possibilities, alternatives. Yet nobody ever seemed interested in discussing whether I wanted different options. The assumption always seemed to be that options should exist, and that everyone should prepare for them. The conversation moved on, but I noticed something. Lisa never asked how I felt about any of it. She only discussed logistics, dates, information, preparation. That was becoming a pattern too. The discussions increasingly focused on management, not preference. 1 week later, I attended my granddaughter Emma's school concert. Afterward, several family members gathered in the lobby. Children ran between groups of adults. People took photographs. Everyone seemed happy. At one point, Emma's other grandmother approached me. We chatted briefly. Then she asked a simple question. "So has Mark narrowed things down yet?" I stared at her. "Narrowed what down?" "The housing options." She looked surprised, then slightly embarrassed. "I thought everyone was discussing it." There it was again. Not the question, the assumption. Everyone believed a process was underway. Everyone believed decisions were being evaluated. Everyone believed Mark was leading that process. I thanked her for the conversation and walked away. But inside, something felt heavier. For months, I'd been noticing individual moments. Now those moments were beginning to connect. A contractor, a consultant, relatives, friends, neighbors, family members, different people, different places, the same assumption. Mark was the person handling my future housing plans, not me. The realization followed me home. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children riding bicycles, neighbors walking dogs, sprinklers running across lawns. Nothing had changed, yet somehow everything felt slightly different. I wasn't worried about moving. I wasn't even sure moving would ever happen. The thing bothering me was much smaller and much larger at the same time. The people around me increasingly seemed to view housing decisions as something that belonged to a group process, a family process, not a personal one. The distinction mattered a lot. The following Tuesday, I received another phone call, this time from a housing services coordinator. The woman was polite, professional, friendly. After confirming my name, she asked, "Will Mark be attending with you?" I paused. Attending what? The consultation. I told her yes. He would be there. She sounded relieved. Wonderful. Then she added something that stayed with me. We usually encourage family decision makers to participate. Family decision makers. The phrase echoed in my head long after the call ended. I knew she hadn't meant anything by it. She didn't know me. She didn't know Mark. She was simply describing a process. Yet the words felt significant, because they reflected something I'd been noticing for months. People increasingly viewed Mark as the decision maker, not because anyone formally said so, because everyone quietly behaved as though it were already true. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Family decision maker. At 82, I'd spent most of my life making decisions. For myself, for my children, for my household, for my future. The possibility that others now viewed someone else in that role felt strangely unsettling. Not insulting, just unfamiliar. A few days later, Mark called. He wanted to review some information before the consultation. I agreed. The next afternoon, he arrived carrying another folder. By then, I was beginning to suspect folders had become permanent members of the family. We sat at the dining room table. Mark organized papers into neat stacks. Housing comparisons, cost estimates, support services, future planning worksheets. As he reviewed them, I noticed something. The language kept changing. Months earlier, everything had been framed as information gathering. Now the discussions sounded more practical, more specific, less about possibilities, more about preparation. Mark pointed to one document. This gives a good overview. He pointed to another. This one compares different paths. Then another. This outlines what makes the most sense. Makes the most sense. I heard that phrase several times, and each time I found myself wondering, makes the most sense for whom? The conversation lasted nearly an hour. I participated, asked questions, shared opinions, yet I couldn't shake a strange feeling. The meeting wasn't being built around my decisions. It felt as though it was being built around helping me understand decisions already under consideration. That distinction grew harder to ignore. The consultation was now only 2 days away. The closer it got, the more aware I became of the shift happening around me. Not one dramatic shift, hundreds of tiny ones. Questions directed elsewhere, assumptions made elsewhere, plans discussed elsewhere. Then eventually presented to me. No single moment felt devastating. The accumulation did. The night before the consultation, I barely slept. I wasn't afraid of the meeting. I was curious. Curious about what would happen when everyone involved sat in the same room. The consultant, Mark, possibly Lisa, and me. For months, I had been observing pieces of a puzzle. The next day felt like the moment those pieces might finally come together. The following afternoon arrived faster than I expected. I dressed carefully. Nothing fancy, just something comfortable, something that felt like me. As I prepared to leave, I looked around my house. The framed photographs, the bookshelves, the dining room table where birthdays had been celebrated for decades, the kitchen where countless family meals had been prepared. I wasn't thinking about leaving. I was thinking about ownership, not legal ownership, something more personal. The feeling of being the person whose answer mattered. The feeling of being the person people looked toward when decisions needed to be made. As I locked the front door behind me, I realized something. For months, I'd been asking whether conversations were happening without me, whether plans were being made without me, whether assumptions were growing without me. Soon, I would finally see how far those changes had gone. Mark pulled into the driveway a few minutes later. He stepped out of the car and smiled. "Ready?" I looked at him, then at the house behind me, then back at him. "Let's go." We climbed into the car. As we drove away, neither of us said much. The consultation office was only 20 minutes away, yet the drive felt longer, not because of distance, because of anticipation. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing. The questions that had followed me for months were waiting inside that building, and for the first time, I suspected the answers might be far more uncomfortable than I expected. The consultation office was smaller than I expected. It occupied the second floor of a professional building near downtown. Nothing about it felt dramatic. There were no major decisions waiting on a conference table. No stacks of contracts, no life-changing documents, just a quiet office, a receptionist, a waiting room, a few chairs. The ordinary setting somehow made everything feel more real. Mark and I arrived a few minutes early. The receptionist greeted us warmly. Then she smiled at Mark. "Thank you for coming with her." The comment wasn't unusual. Still, I noticed it. I noticed almost everything now. A few minutes later, a woman introduced herself as Karen. She was the housing consultant, professional, friendly, calm, the kind of person who spent her days helping families navigate difficult decisions. She led us into a conference room. A large round table sat in the center. Karen took one seat. Mark sat beside me. I sat across from both of them. The meeting began casually. Karen asked about my home, how long I had lived there, what I liked most about it. The questions felt personal, comforting. For a few minutes, I relaxed. Then the conversation slowly shifted. Karen began discussing future planning, accessibility, support options, long-term housing considerations, the same subjects that had followed me for months. Only now they were sitting directly in front of me, organized into folders, charts, worksheets, timelines. Karen opened a binder. Then she asked her first planning question. "What concerns you most about the future?" I started answering. "I've always hoped to remain." Mark spoke at the same time. "I think the biggest concern is safety." Karen nodded. She wrote something down. Then she looked toward Mark, not toward me, toward him. The conversation continued. At first, I told myself it meant nothing. One question didn't matter. One answer didn't matter. Then another question came. "What level of support do you think will eventually be necessary?" Again, I prepared to answer. Again, Mark answered first. Karen nodded. More notes, more writing, more attention directed toward him. I sat quietly, listening, watching, trying to understand why the room felt different from every room I'd ever sat in before. The discussion moved forward: housing options, home modifications, future planning, potential timelines. Throughout the conversation, something subtle kept happening. Karen would ask a question. Mark would answer. Karen would respond to Mark. The process repeated again and again. Nobody seemed uncomfortable. Nobody appeared confused. Everything flowed naturally, as though everyone already understood the arrangement, except me. About 20 minutes into the meeting, Karen pulled out a comparison worksheet. Several housing paths were listed: remain at home, age-in-place renovations, independent living, assisted living, future transition planning. Karen reviewed each option carefully. Then she turned a page. This is usually where families begin narrowing priorities. Families, not individuals. Families. The word lingered in my mind. Karen looked across the table. For a moment, I thought she was looking at me. Instead, she looked at Mark. What direction feels most realistic right now? The room became very quiet. Not dramatically quiet, just still. I waited. Part of me expected Karen to turn toward me next, to ask what I thought, to ask what I wanted, to ask where I saw myself living. The question never came. Mark answered, I think staying in the house is best for now. Karen nodded. That makes sense. She made another note. The conversation continued. Something inside me shifted, not because I disagreed. In truth, I also wanted to remain in my home. That wasn't the issue. The issue was something else. The answer that moved the meeting forward had not come from me. And apparently it didn't need to. For months I had seen small signs, tiny moments, questions directed elsewhere, conversations happening elsewhere, plans discussed elsewhere. This felt different, not bigger, clearer. For the first time, I could see the pattern operating in real time. Karen moved to the next section. Future planning considerations, potential timelines, decision triggers, family coordination. The language felt practical, organized, reasonable. No one was trying to control me. No one was being unkind. That was what made everything so difficult to explain. The room contained good people, people trying to help, people trying to prepare. Yet somehow I felt less important with every passing minute. Halfway through the meeting, Karen reviewed several possible scenarios. Then she asked another question. If conditions change in the next few years, who would most likely coordinate future housing decisions? This time, I didn't even begin answering. I already knew what would happen. Karen looked directly at Mark. Mark answered, I would. Karen smiled. That's usually helpful. She wrote something down. Then she continued. The conversation never paused. Nobody asked whether I agreed. Nobody asked whether I preferred another arrangement. Nobody questioned the assumption. The answer was accepted immediately. The room moved forward. And for the first time I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not confusion, not uncertainty, recognition. The pattern I had been chasing for months suddenly became visible. Not because someone explained it, because I was watching it happen. Question, answer, acceptance, forward, movement, again, and again, and again. The meeting continued for another half hour. I participated when asked, shared opinions, answered direct questions. But increasingly, the structure of the room felt fixed. Karen viewed Mark as the coordinator, the family representative, the future decision maker. Not because anyone officially announced it, because everyone quietly behaved as though it were true. Toward the end of the meeting, Karen summarized everything. Then she reviewed the recommended next steps. Several options remained open. Nothing had been finalized. Nothing had been decided permanently. Then she reached the final page. This is usually where families choose a working direction. She glanced at the notes. Then she looked at Mark. Not me. Mark. So are we moving forward with the aging-in-place renovation plan for now? The question hung in the air. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. I looked at Karen, then at Mark, then at the folder sitting in front of me. Months of conversations seemed to gather inside that silence. The contractor, the brochures, the relatives, the assumptions, the planning, the research. Every piece suddenly pointed toward this moment. Karen wasn't asking me. She wasn't asking the homeowner. She wasn't asking the woman whose future was being discussed. She was asking Mark. And everyone in the room accepted that. Mark nodded. Yes. His answer came calmly, confidently, naturally. I think that's the best path. Karen smiled. Good. She wrote the decision into her notes. Then she turned the page. The meeting moved forward. Nobody looked at me. Nobody asked if I agreed. Nobody asked for my approval. Nobody corrected the arrangement. The answer had already done its job. The room accepted it. The process accepted it. The future planning accepted it. And suddenly I understood what had been happening all along. Not because power had been taken from me, because it had quietly moved somewhere else. Months earlier, people still looked to me first. Now they looked to Mark. Months earlier, my answer carried the conversation forward. Now his answer carried it forward. Months earlier, decisions about my future began with me. Now they began somewhere else. The painful part wasn't that Mark answered. The painful part was how completely normal it felt to everyone else. That was the moment I finally saw it. Not a housing discussion, not a planning process, not a family meeting, a transfer. A quiet transfer that had happened so gradually, nobody noticed it, including me. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Karen thanked us for coming. She handed several documents to Mark. Then she handed a few to me. The gesture was small, ordinary, professional, yet I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even now, the flow of information seemed to move toward him first. As Mark gathered the folders, I sat quietly, watching, listening, understanding. For months, I had believed the question was, are people making plans without me? Now I knew the real question. When did everyone stop needing my answer? The drive home felt quieter than the drive there, not because Mark was avoiding conversation. Neither of us seemed to know what to say. The meeting had been polite, professional, reasonable. Nothing dramatic had happened. No arguments, no confrontations, no shocking decisions. Yet I couldn't stop replaying one moment, the final question, the final answer, the final acceptance. A question about my future had entered the room. Mark answered it, and everyone moved forward, as though that was exactly how things were supposed to work. When we arrived at my house, Mark carried the folders inside. He placed them neatly on the kitchen table. The same table where so many family decisions had once begun with me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Mark looked at me. You okay? I nodded. I'm fine. And in many ways, I was. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt in the way people expect. The feeling was more complicated than that. Mark wasn't trying to take control. He wasn't trying to push me aside. He believed he was helping. The consultant believed she was helping. Everyone involved believed they were helping. That was what made the situation so difficult. Nobody had done anything wrong, yet something important had still changed. After Mark left, I made a cup of tea and sat alone in the kitchen. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor. The house felt exactly the same. The walls hadn't moved, the furniture hadn't changed, the photographs remained where they had always been. Nothing was different, except me. For months, I had been searching for a single moment, one conversation, one decision, one event that explained everything. Now I realized there had never been a single moment. The transfer had happened gradually. One answer, then another. One assumption, then another. One conversation, then another. By the time I finally noticed it, everyone had already adjusted. The contractor had adjusted. The relatives had adjusted. The church members had adjusted. The consultant had adjusted. Even Mark had adjusted. The only person still catching up was me. That realization stayed with me for several days. The following week, life returned to normal, or at least it appeared to. I attended church, visited family, ran errands, spoke with neighbors. Yet I noticed something different in myself. I paid closer attention, not to what people said, to who they looked at, who they waited for, who they expected to answer. Once you notice a shift like that, it's difficult to stop seeing it. One Sunday afternoon, the family gathered at my house. Nothing special, just a casual visit. The grandchildren watched television. Lisa helped organize lunch. Mark repaired a loose cabinet hinge. At one point, Emma walked into the kitchen. "Grandma, what are we doing for Thanksgiving?" I smiled. The question felt familiar, comforting. For a brief moment, it felt like old times. Then Emma looked past me, toward Mark. She waited, not because she meant to, not because she was rude, because she had grown accustomed to it. The answer came from Mark, and everyone continued talking. I stood there holding a dish towel, watching, understanding. The moment lasted only seconds. Yet somehow it explained everything. The shift wasn't living inside meetings, or consultants, or planning documents. The shift was living inside everyday life, inside habits, inside expectations, inside routines nobody consciously noticed anymore. That was the true change. Not that someone else occasionally answered, that everyone expected them to. A few days later, I found myself sitting on the back porch. The same porch where I had fallen months earlier, the same fall that had started all of this. The autumn air felt cool. Leaves moved gently across the yard. I thought about the years behind me, raising children, managing a household, making decisions, solving problems, holding the family together. Those responsibilities hadn't disappeared overnight. They had simply become less necessary, and eventually, less expected. I think that was the hardest part to accept, not losing control. Losing relevance. There is a difference. Control can be fought over. Relevance simply fades, quietly, gradually, without anyone intending for it to happen. As I sat there, I realized something else. My family still loved me. That had never changed. Mark loved me. Lisa loved me. The grandchildren loved me. The consultant hadn't seen me as unimportant. She had simply seen Mark as the person coordinating things. The world around us had adapted, and my family had adapted with it. The painful part wasn't their intentions. The painful part was how easy the transition had become. That understanding didn't make me feel better, but it made me feel clearer. For the first time, I stopped asking whether anyone was trying to replace me. They weren't. The question had always been wrong. The real question was, What happens when people slowly stop needing your answer? Several weeks after the consultation, Mark stopped by again. We sat together in the kitchen. The folders remained untouched in a drawer. No immediate decisions had been made. No moving plans existed. No deadlines were approaching. Life continued. Eventually, I asked him something. When did you start handling all of this? Mark looked surprised. He thought about it for a moment. Then he shrugged. I don't know. The answer felt honest, not defensive, not calculated. Honest. I guess it just happened. I nodded, because that was exactly what I had finally realized. It just happened. No meeting started it. No decision created it. No villain caused it. The shift arrived one small step at a time, so slowly that nobody noticed the distance being traveled, including me. That afternoon, after Mark left, I walked through the house. The living room, the hallway, the kitchen, the dining room, every room held memories. Every room held years of decisions that once belonged entirely to me. And yet, standing there, I understood something important. The house wasn't what I was afraid of losing. The authority wasn't what I was afraid of losing. Not completely. What I feared was becoming someone whose presence remained important while her voice became optional. That was the feeling that stayed with me. Not anger, not bitterness, not regret, just awareness. A quiet awareness I hadn't possessed before. Life after 70 teaches many lessons. Some arrive suddenly. Others arrive so gradually you don't recognize them until they're already part of your life. This was one of those lessons. I still lived in my home. I still made many decisions. I still had people who loved me. Yet somewhere along the way, another change had happened too. The family no longer looked to me first, and once I saw it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. The hardest part wasn't realizing someone else had started answering. The hardest part was realizing everyone had already accepted it. I wasn't losing my home. I was losing the place my answer used to hold. If this story felt familiar, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever noticed your role changing inside your own family, or realized decisions were starting to happen differently than before? If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video. And if you're interested in conversations about life after 70, senior psychology, family dynamics, and the challenges of aging and independence, consider subscribing and joining us for future stories.